Thank you. Well, thank you very much indeed for that introduction. Now, to give the first talk of the day on Friday the 13th is not very auspicious, but I'm going to do my best. And I'm afraid I have to admit, this is not a scientific talk. It has no data at all, but it's really a brief reflection on what I hope will at least be of some little interest. What I'm going to do is address this topic. What are the difficulties in formulating what is a neurological disease? And I'm going to illustrate this largely with the example of epilepsy. Now, examining the notion of disease, as actually all psychiatrists know, has become rather topical in recent years, triggered mainly because of the remarkable increase in the numbers of people diagnosed with some psychiatric disorders, such as ADHD, autism. ADHD now said, when I looked it up yesterday, to affect 10% of all children. And the prevalence is rising. And the reason for this rise has nothing to do with any biological change, but it's the cultural criteria used in formulating the diagnosis which has changed, in my opinion, anyway. In other words, it's a matter of fashion and the result of choices made based on subjective opinion and not objective fact. And so the question arises as to what extent are neurological diseases, which neurologists like to think are very objective, to what extent are they also subject to subjective choice and to fashion and trends? And are there any differences between the diagnosis of psychiatric and neurological disease? Now, psychiatric diseases are usually defined, or are defined, by patterns of symptoms without an identifiable underlying pathology or physiological change. And this is at the core of the problems of definition that have bedeviled psychiatry, really. And to solve this, the DSM now produces the definitive list. But the DSM undergoes revisions every few years, and these are very strongly influenced by personal and societal factors. And it's this loose and malleable nature which, from the scientific point of view, blurs the boundary between health and mental illness. And politics play a major role. You only got to look at the handling, for instance, of gender dysphoria and so on. And it's so extreme that, as you know, that some people have even doubted the existence of psychiatric disorders. Now, neurologists like to assume that diagnosis is more objective because it's based on the medical model. And this is the important distinction. And the medical model of a disease is defined by an underlying pathological or physiological abnormality. And this, neurologists believe, allows precision, and it should be objective. However, even when a rigid and purist medical model is applied, there are complications which do introduce subjectivity, and these are what I'm briefly going to discuss. One such complication is the confusion of a symptom with a disease. Now, before 1900, there was no problem because symptoms were defined as diseases. But then when the sciences of pathology and physiology advanced, neurological diseases became conceived as having an organic basis, and the symptoms were just an indication that the disease was present. But it's very easy to confuse these two, and epilepsy is, it seems to me, a classical example, because the definition of epilepsy is the occurrence of epileptic seizures. And to be honest, this is a ludicrous circular definition. There are many causes of symptoms and many different types of physiology. And in that sense, and in the medical sense, epilepsy really isn't a unitary disease at all. it's as unitary, for instance, as cough or anemia, and they're not diseases. And so the medical model would define epilepsy, would not include epilepsy. It might include a whole series of diseases of which epileptic seizures are part. There are many epilepsies, in other words. Perhaps an even more blatant example is functional neurological disorder, which is an entity in which the symptoms of no known cause are turned into a neurological disorder. I don't think there's any difference between a disease and a disorder, by the way. And in the past, these have been diagnosed as the disease of hysteria or neurasthenia and so on. And surely FND is just a reincarnation of this concept. A second problem concerns the effect of changing criteria of a disease. Now, in scientific medicine with the medical model, changing criteria usually narrows the definition. For instance, you find a new genetic cause or a pathological cause, and this will break up the disease into smaller subunits. However, in some diseases, the criteria have changed, which extend the diagnosis. And there's usually no pathological or mechanistic reason for this. This has happened in migraine, for instance, where now almost every headache is called a migraine. And of course, autism is a classic example, which traditionally referred to children with a severe neurological condition comprising delayed speech, marked cognitive deficit, repetitive behaviors, behavioral change, and so on. And now much milder cases are included, and this has changed the complete meaning of the condition. A third complication relates to changing classifications or terminologies. Now, this happens in epilepsy every few years. In fact, probably more than every few years, and is largely determined by the ILAE task force, which reconstitute every few years, and every time they change a term or a syndrome or a categorization. And this is made without any scientific or mechanistic basis at all. I think it's equivalent to moving deck chairs around on the deck of the Titanic, for instance, and it has complications which I'm going to come back to. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is the issue of assigning an etiology to a disease. Now, as etiology or causation is at the heart of the medical model, assigning these is important when making a disease definition. And there are a number of issues about assigning etiology which are, in effect, subjective. The first is the question of levels. Now, Hewlings-Jackson wrote about this, taking epilepsy as an example. Is the cause of a disease the physiological change at molecular level? Is it the cellular change with membranes? Or is it the remote cause, as a stroke or a tumor, for instance? And if you define the disease by in these different ways, you're going to get very different definitions and very different classifications. Currently, we ignore the molecular and the cellular basis altogether in our classifications, and I think that's probably a mistake. The second problem with defining etiology of most cerebral diseases, and particularly epilepsy, is the question that they are all, almost all, multifactorial in nature. And epilepsy is a prime example. And these are slides from Lennox's book in the 1960s, where he tried to illustrate the epilepsy as a river with all these different streams coming into it, some organic, some non-organic, stress is included, environmental features, the remote causes, etc. And they feed into the river, and then the epileptic threshold where a seizure occurs is the height of the water in the reservoir. Now, of course, that's kind of very pictorial way of thinking about it, which is typical of Linux, but I think it makes a very good point. The other point about definition of epilepsy is that it's an evolving process, and the cause at the onset of the epilepsy is definitely not the cause of continuing epileptic seizures. And you can see this because of the evolution of drug resistance, for instance, the silent period after a head injury, and then the epilepsy developing later. Something's going on in that period. The question of secondary epileptogenesis, mirror foci, and so on. And so there is no doubt that cause changes over time. And that, of course, means that when you're defining a disease by its cause, you need to make a choice about what time this definition is taking, accounts for. And then there is the question of genetic causes. It's often said that epilepsy is a genetic disorder, and indeed there are quite a few genetic influences, as Lennox actually said. But to call it a genetic disorder is completely wrong, in my opinion. And there was a recent change of idiopathic generalized epilepsy, a change in terminology into genetic generalized epilepsy. Luckily, I think this trend has been modified a bit. And this is despite the fact that there is no single gene, or even a gene which has any marked effect, identifiable in most cases of epilepsy. And there are a number of susceptibility genes which possibly have a minor effect on epileptic threshold. But when you think about it, there are far more important environmental factors like stress, hormonal state, drinking alcohol, and so on. And these really are, in my opinion, as much a cause as are these minor genetic influences. There's an analogy here with height, which is a human characteristic associated with large numbers of genetic variants, but is also much influenced, probably more influenced by nutrition, childhood deprivation, the ingestion of milk with hormones. These have a significant effect on height, which have nothing to do with these genetic determinants. And this was nicely put by David Dobbs, who said the genome of most common conditions is infected by maggots. These maggots are many associated genes of tiny significance, and they result in a mass of genes explaining little. And there's no doubt that maggots affect the epilepsy world. So you could answer, does any of this matter? I think it matters for a number of reasons. First, definition provides a framework for research, for making hypotheses and for devising investigation or research studies. And mixing up symptoms and diseases, not accounting for the level, can frame the research questions badly and is really a straitjacket which can prevent medical advance. And it seems to me very likely that this has happened in epilepsy research in the last 20 years. Excuse me. Changing disease criteria and tinkering around with classification also causes confusion. And it's pointless if there's no real change in the underlying biology. And this confusion is not only in medicine, but in many social situations, such as the law courts, in welfare legislation, in employment, in education provision. And, excuse me, I've got a frog in my throat. And changing terminology and definitions, I think, can cause havoc. And often overlooked also is the fact that changing criteria invalidates the findings of previous scientific studies. And this is of great importance at the moment, for instance, in the question of whether valproate causes autism. Now, this is based on a important study in 2013 of a cohort of children, usually from in the late 1990s to the early 20th century. And this was before the changes in autism diagnosis, which have now come into play, and which, because of changed criteria, and which have caused the increase in numbers. And if you change the criteria, this surely invalidates the finding of the study. And I think this is a great problem, for instance, in many political and legal situations. And when it comes to chronic cerebral diseases, there is another very profound limitation which affects neurology. And that is that to the patient and to society, there's often a difference in meaning, the essential meaning of a disease, to what the doctors think a disease is. And this is where psychiatry trumps neurology, because psychiatry takes this into account. But for instance, being epileptic is far more stigmatizing and has far more far-reaching effects than just having epileptic seizures. You can have a seizure once or twice a year, but you're epileptic the whole time. And this has all sorts of effects on self-esteem and on your social situation. And labeling a disease as genetic particularly has dire consequences. Genetic differences assign people to subgroups and underclasses, really. And this results, or has resulted historically, in social exclusion and in coercion. Throughout history, calling a disease genetic has caused individuals great harm, and many of the because of eugenics, and many of the policies of today's medical procedures have similarities, in fact, close similarities really, to many of the eugenic policies in previous generations. So, just to conclude, so where does this leave neurological diagnosis or disease definition for a condition like epilepsy? Well, assigning etiology, although fundamental to the model, is complex and subjective choices have to be made. Changing criteria or classification without good reason just causes confusion, and mixing up symptoms with diseases introduces an illogicality and can damage the research framework and future understanding. And finally, the relevance of a neurological disease, I think, is damaged enormously if you don't consider the social and cultural factors. So we can conclude, I think, that neurological diseases may not have the same degree of subjectivity as psychiatric diseases, but there is a significant subjective element to definition and diagnosis. And we should acknowledge, as neurologists, acknowledge these limitations. And we should recognize that these our disease definitions are by no means wholly objective. And that's the simple message I wanted to get over. Thank you very much indeed.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I think we have plenty of time for some questions for our next talk. So open to the floor. And Vaughan, let me know if there's anyone online. Yeah. Jeremy, is there a roving mic? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Simon, for a very interesting and reflective talk. I wonder whether the distinction between certain things being biological and pinned to pathology and certain things being sort of different and having a social construction kind of risks us ignoring the fact that really all medicine is socially constructed and is a social function. And I think that even what we call biology has a social construction at some level. And I think, for me, what's more interesting, if we think about this diagnostic creep that you've referred to, is not the fact that it happens, because diagnoses are always going to change over time because of the social factors, but whose interests are served by the change in diagnostic criteria. So, for example, if we take autism, the expansion in the criterion is helpful because it recognizes that there are further people than those that you identified in your talk who are disabled as a result of society not recognizing their differences. And so it's actually liberating to people to expand the the boundaries of what we call autism. Whereas if we take dementia, the constant creep of saying, well, you know, mild cognitive impairment is dementia, subjective cognitive impairment may be pre-dementia. Even now, I can tell you, the World Dementia Council is going to hold its annual meeting in London in October, and the subtitle is The New Patient Before Symptoms. So whose interests are served by that? So, you know, obviously we know it's the medical industrial complex, i.e. big pharma. So I think for me it's about interests. I think we have to bring that in, understanding that everything has an element of social construction. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And you're right to say that biology itself has a social construction because it's based on whatever people will fund, for instance, at any one time, and so on and so on. I think the point I was trying to make is the neurologists tend to sneer at the idea that their diseases are not objective and firm and definitive. And indeed, many of them aren't. Many of them are firm and objective. You know, when you have a narrowly defined condition. But when you've got a condition like epilepsy, which anyway straddles neurology and psychiatry, when you've got a condition like that, I think it's important to realize that much of what we define and say, particularly, is subjective and is open to fashion. And I don't think this is recognized really by the epilepsy movement, which is constantly making new definitions and so on, really without any objective base. And I think it's important to sort of recognize that. And I think Jackson's idea of what is etiology is really important in research. Because, you know, when you write an epilepsy grant, you start off by saying, you know, there's generalized, and there's grand mal, and there's petit mal, or tonic-clonic, and so on. But, you know, what you're really, you're defining the disease at a very superficial level. And I think it's important to recognize these definitions are a matter of choice and subjectivity. As for autism, you say that it's expanded, and that's a welcome thing. In fact, it has reduced the stigma of the condition. I absolutely agree. But there are people at the extreme end, at the bad end of the autistic spectrum, who feel that they've been slightly cheated of a diagnosis, which, you know, affects the child is extremely badly affected. And yet they include now people with nuclear physicists and politicians who are now so-called or have so-called autism. It's a cultural definition, and it shouldn't be really, in my opinion. I think it's a bad. It's an example which is bad for medicine, if you like, to have such fluctuating defininistions.
One more question. Narinder Kapoor has had his hand up for a while. There's a microphone on the way.
Thank you. Just a couple of points. You referred to FND. So do you regard FND as a neurological disorder or a functional disorder? Number one. Number two, if you take a condition like a stammering, would you regard stammering as a neurological condition? And I mean, if you get an anatomical correlate of something, does that then mean it's a neurological condition if you get an anatomical correlate?
Yeah, so I'm probably going to get into hot water about FND, but I honestly cannot see the point of calling a symptom a disease, which is what's happened in FND, when you have no real and no, this is where I am in hot water, have no real basis. Hysteria had all sorts of explanations, which psychiatrists now seem largely to ignore. Neurasthenia was common in the 19th century, and now nobody uses the term. I just wonder whether FND isn't really the same category. Now, as for stammering, I know nothing about it, but I've always presumed it had a physiological basis. So you're going to ask, does FND have a physiological base? Well, it has so variable and it's so different in manifestations that I really wonder whether there is any known, will ever be any known physiology. Anyway, I better stop there. And I do think that neurological disease should have an objective basis. And I think that's what separates it from psychiatric disease.